Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Let's see. So I'm going to be talking about clinical study startup in the United States. I have a few slides here in the beginning that will possible duplicate a little bit what Meredith went over, so I'll skip over those. This is, so just speaking a little bit about ProMedica, we are a full-service CRO located in California. We have been in business since 1985, and when we started out, we only did medical devices. We also do other areas such as pharmaceuticals and biotechnology and so forth as well. I have been with the company since 1997, so 25 years of experience doing this. And as Young mentioned, I've done about every role, so I can answer most questions about what to do in a U.S. clinical study. So one of the biggest areas in starting is picking your CRO along with your regulatory expert, like Meredith was saying, because we can go over what different services you might need for the clinical study. Do you need statistics? Do you need project management, site management? What areas do you need? And then picking your CRO, also you can talk with them about what different therapeutic experience do they have and does it match with your device study needs. Another thing when picking your CRO is looking at their longevity in the study. Being around almost 40 years, we've seen most everything and can help provide guidance in different areas and what comes up. And also what your CRO's staff and training is. You know, it's nice to know that your CRO has got experience and your staff has been around for many years, so they also have seen lots of issues and can help try to have your study run as efficiently as possible. After you've picked your CRO, you'll start looking at much of the regulatory areas, and we'll skip over some of these slides as they've been previously discussed, looking at your device classification, class 1, 2, or 3. And another area that was discussed is once you have your classification, you'll be looking at if your device is considered significant risk or not significant risk. Now, while you as a sponsor will want to initially come up with this because it will impact your strategy on what kind of clinical study you need, and as mentioned, you can also go to FDA, but technically the final designation of this will end up being made by the Institutional Review Board. So this slide here just mentions to you how a device is classified as significant risk. And as mentioned, I think the big idea here is that it's not so much on the actual device, but how it will be used. And that is important because the use versus device in making this determination. Now, you will provide your protocol and your device designation to the institutional review boards, though again, they have the final decision and they can disagree with you. Most of the time, if the disagreement would be, you say your device is not significant risk, and they disagree and say it is a significant risk study. And you would have to go with the IRB's determination of risk on your study. And so the nice thing is, now if you have already discussed with FDA, because maybe you are unsure, the FDA, as I mentioned, their actual decision would be final, and you would need to submit that to the IRB so that they would know that FDA has made the decision on your device. Okay. And this just talks about, again, if you are a non-significant risk, you would submit that to the IRB. They would review it, but you would not need to submit to the FDA. So again, this goes in with the overall strategy when you would be talking with people like, Meredith on the strategy for it and what kind of study that you would need to do. most of your IVD in these types of studies will probably be considered not significant risk, which is nice because then you don't have to follow all of the Code 812 federal regulations. There are some that you have to follow, but it's not as intense as a significant risk study. And of course, there are guidance documents on FDA's website that would give you what different requirements would need to be met. And here I've listed some of them for you. So the non-significant risks, you do have to follow the abbreviations. There's labeling requirements, IRB approval. You still have to consent your subjects. But you don't need to have the IDE approved. And you, those are probably the most important things that you would need to know for the study. Oh, I'll go over that one. Medical device importing. This is obviously very critical, and this can be an item that takes a little bit longer, and I believe Meredith did also already hit a few things on this, most important being that you need the U.S. agent, and to have that person who will be communicating with FDA on your behalf. And luckily she mentioned already some major do's and don'ts on having that agent, but this allows you to get your device imported. And then some of this information is also critical in order to get your clinical insurance, which is a whole another topic that would be started early on in the process, because you would definitely want clinical trial insurance when you're starting the study. And here are a few websites that you can go to get some more information on the device importing. So now that you've done those things, you are getting into your protocol development. And this is where a CRO can be very helpful with you as far as what are your inclusion-exclusion criteria. Sometimes, many times when you're coming into a new country, certain ways that the U.S. doctors practice might be different. So you'll want to look at what are your inclusion and exclusion to see if there needs to be any changes that would make it more effective to run in the United States. And we can give you that information. Now, sometimes there might be something that you have to meet FDA's regulations to get the data you need approved, but you might want to also find out that that's going to be potentially a limiting inclusion criteria that could slow down enrollment. And that's something that then you'd want to make sure you're tracking as subjects are being enrolled and why they're screen failing, if that's due to a particular inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then that could be something, depending on FDA's flexibility, you could go back and discuss with them. Again, it definitely depends on what your endpoints are, of course. And also looking at, sometimes we have clients coming in and they want to collect a lot of data, more than what's needed for just their clinical endpoints. And this is something, again, you want to talk with your CRO on, because those assessments could become very costly to you, and you want to look at what is really critical to reach FDA approval versus what testing might just be something that is nice to have and that you're wanting additional information on. So you'll want to balance your study needs and study costs and timeline. You'll also want to look at these assessments as far as, do they require any particular instruments that the study sites need to have? Because maybe not all study sites will have that instrument, and then you either need to rent or purchase it or find another study site that you want to use. So really looking at these criteria in your assessment of study schedule and visits is important to make sure that you're doing as efficient and cost-effective study. And these are things that your CRO will be able to help you with based on their knowledge of how United States sites work. Once your protocol is finalized, you would be able to obviously submit it if it requires IDE approval. So once these main points occur, then a lot of times my team comes in when you get the clinical operations side going. So looking at your protocol, you might need some different vendors. Maybe you're going to have lab work being done, or a reading center, or maybe there are ancillary supplies that need to be ordered. So we would work with you to identify those vendors, make sure that they are qualified, and so that you could use them for a clinical study. And you need to get the contracts going with them and make sure that also with the setup, does their data need to be imported into your EDC database, or does it go directly to the statistician? If it's a reading center, does there going to be certification that the sites need to get started to use it? So they're getting your vendors identified early on is also important in the process. Next thing your CRO will start doing is creating study plans, tools, and trackers. And these will really help keep your study on track. And these are things that you will have visibility to so that you know exactly where your study is and where you are at any moment in time. So things like site activation trackers, where is a study site in process from being identified to being able to enroll subjects. How is the regulatory documents going? Do they have IRB approval? Do we have contracts signed? Those are important items. Your monitoring plan that tells the CRAs, contract research associates, how to work in monitoring in the field. I'm sure this is very similar to the Korean studies. Your project plan, so communication plan, how is the US CRO going to be providing you with reports and updates on your study? How often will you be meeting? What is your risk management? And also you will begin looking at your electronic trial master file and potentially, depending on the size of the study, if a clinical trial management system is needed. Sometimes if the study is smaller, you don't need that, and it can all be done with Excel, and we would work with you on that, on what, again, is the most cost and time efficient need for your study. And then next, we would look at identifying sites. So you have to identify sites that are qualified by training and experience. They do not require to be, there's no type of US certification required to have to be a study investigator, but FDA will look at their CVs and to know that they have, again, the right experience to do a study. They can be new, they can have never done a clinical study before, though we would want to make sure your CRO was working very closely with those sites so that they don't make any mistakes. We normally like to use investigators that had done previously clinical studies because that can be the most efficient. As a CRO, most of your CROs are going to have databases of previous investigators that they have worked with that they can introduce you to. We have knowledge of their experience, how they can recruit, and that can be very important to know. Sometimes there are many KOLs out there, key opinion leaders, that sponsors like to use for their clinical studies because they might be good on doing presentations and podium speakers. Sometimes, though, those sites are so in demand by every sponsor, they are not always the best at enrolling or recruiting. So you want to balance that out to make sure that if you need a KOL in your study, that you also have, and maybe they're not great enrollers, that you also have study sites that can enroll and get you the patients you need. So again, really discussing your sites with your CRO can help make sure you have the right balance that you need for your study. Another item with your picking your study site is, are they part of a big university and hospital, or are they an independent doctor? If they are part of a university or hospital system, you normally have to use that site's local IRB. And those can sometimes take a lot longer to get IRB approval from than an independent doctor who can use a central IRB. If you are not, depending on your therapeutic area, and if you're needing treatment that needs to be done in a hospital setting, many times you can use doctors outside of a hospital university that you can use a local IRB, and that can be much more efficient for study startup. Again, your CRO will be able to help you make those types of decisions. If you are on your own before you've contacted a CRO, looking at clinicaltrials.gov for similar studies, a lot of times they will list the doctors that have participated in those studies, and you can see their names, and that can be a way that if you wanted to start before you get a CRO and looking at doctors for a potential study. Also, with your CRO, there are a number of U.S. medical conferences, and these are also great places to have meetings and talk with your doctors. As a CRO, many times we set up dinners and events with local doctors and sponsors at these medical conferences to discuss your clinical trials, and that can be a great resource as well. Another item that takes longer that you want to start right away once you have your protocol designed is creating your database. These can take 2 to 3 months depending on the complexity of the study, but you want to make sure your database is Part 11 compliant per FDA and has audit trails and security logon, along with numerous other items. So database development would occur, and you would also want to look at, there's risk-based approaches. So you could submit, actually also, when you submit to the FDA, say if you have to have an IDE and they have 30 days to review it, and you think you've had your Q-Sub meetings and you think that this is the final protocol, you could start database development, but you have to look at the risk. If you're not sure if FDA is going to agree with all your assessments and testing schedule, if you begin your database development, then you could have, and there are changes made, you would have to reassess, do we complete the development, and then make some changes afterwards, which could be a little time-consuming and costly, but maybe that is still more, if your timeline is very important, maybe that is still worth the risk of getting that 30 days head start. So again, that's discussing with your CRO what is the most efficient and time effective for your study. Another thing with the database development is you would start looking at, if you have to have a randomized study, you would start looking at your randomization plan. Would you need an IWRS system, or is your study small enough that you can do paper randomization envelopes? Sometimes, even though there's all these great electronic systems out there, sometimes the old-fashioned paper can be more efficient for you. So discussing that with your team is very important. Let's see. I think that hits those points. Next thing you would want to look at is you've started identifying sites, but you want to conduct a feasibility with them. You want to collect their confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement and potentially provide them with a protocol synopsis at minimum. You want to talk with them about what past studies have they done that are similar to yours. How long did their enrollment take? How many subjects were they able to enroll in that period of time? What is their clinical staff? Do they have study coordinators? How long have they been there? How many studies have they worked on? How many studies are they currently working on? If you have a site that's working on 20 studies and their study coordinators got 10 studies each, are they going to be able to dedicate the time and resources to get yours done efficiently? And also, will the investigator have appropriate time to adequately oversee your study? And that is something that FDA looks at. If you have lots of protocol deviations and patients with missed visits, they might see that maybe this investigator did not have adequate time. So we normally do this feasibility via questionnaire and phone calls. And then we look at which sites we think are best and would recommend which ones to move forward to the next phase, which is an on-site visit. One thing I do mention is that sometimes before doing these on-site visits in the feasibility area, you might want to start looking at rough budget numbers with the sites. We like to give them a study budget that we think is adequate and have a discussion with them. We've seen cases where this has not happened, and you go on site to do a qualification visit, so that's your time and money there. You're all excited to use this doctor, and they want 3 times the study budget that you want to pay. And so the sponsors decided, no, we don't want to use them for a study. So then you've wasted time and money doing your on-site visits. So being able to talk with the site before that, this is our study budget, are they within it? That can, again, make you be a more efficient startup process. Something else when looking at picking your sites within the feasibility process is also looking at the therapeutic area for your product. Different parts of the United States have higher concentrations of potentially different ethnicities and many other areas, certain disease indications. A lot of times in the southern states in the United States tends to be some higher amounts of obesity and diabetes, so maybe looking for study sites there is more efficient than other states. So that is something that, again, your CRO will look at and helping you design where we want to find the doctors that are going to best enroll in your study. Looks like I went out of a little order here. This is talking about the study budget. So now you think you have the sites that you want to use, so you knew an on-site qualification visit. This is where you go on-site, meet with the doctor, meet with the study coordinator. You want to have them give a tour to review, all the equipment they have. And this is important because if you don't, sometimes sites are like, oh yes, I have this equipment or I have that, and then you go on site and, well, that wasn't the brand that we need, or this is an older version, you need a software update. So going on site to see these things. You're also able to see how the site works. What is their study flow? How do they bring patients in? How much time does the investigator dedicate to meeting with you? If they only have 5 minutes, you can kind of go, well, how really interested are you in this study? Are you going to actually dedicate your time? That tells you a lot about a doctor's interest. Once that on-site visit is done, your CRO will recommend a site to move forward or not, and then if they do, you would let the sites know if they've been selected or not. For sites that are selected, we would start to negotiate the investigator agreement and the final budget process. A lot of times when we know that we're already going to go do the on-site qualification, sometimes you will send your templates, so that way that the doctor's legal department can begin reviewing these and starting to give you red line comments and make the final approval process a little bit more efficient. Also, during this time, when you're doing the budgeting, you have to collect confirmation of a doctor's financial disclosure, how much they are being paid outside of the clinical study, potentially by by the sponsor. Are they a consultant for you for other reasons that you're paying them money, or do they own stock in your company, or does their family own stock in the company? So there are some basic requirements. So your CRO will collect that information for you, and then when your final 510K or PMA submission is made, you would submit to FDA that financial disclosure information. And the doctors also need to update that up 1 year after the study is done as well. Let's see. When you're picking your investigator, and this is normally done when you're doing the feasibility study portion, you would even make sure they've not been terminated from a clinical study and that they're not debarred by FDA. There is a listing on the FDA's website where you can go and your CRO will confirm that an investigator or a study coordinator has not been debarred from clinical studies. Next, we would start to collect essential regulatory documents, such as your CVs, medical licenses, GCP training, sign signature pages. So these are a lot of basic, and this is all part of the ICH documents that are probably very similar. Also part of this process, you'll be getting your informed consent and your HIPAA form. I believe I already kind of mentioned about the local versus central IRBs. Each of them provides the same oversight, just one is central IRB. You can have multiple doctors all within one IRB, which makes the submission very easy. Some sites that have to use a local IRB, you can ask them if they would be willing to delegate their authority to your central IRB, but they are not required to do that. They could say no and require themselves to continue to be the IRB. But again, as I mentioned, you want to know that if a site that you really want to use has a local IRB, sometimes they only meet once a month. More nowadays, they're getting better about meeting more often, but it can take many more months than a central IRB to get going. Let's see. And again, in a clinical study, you can work, if you have multiple sites and 4 of them can all use your central IRB, but one has to use a local IRB. You can work with multiple IRBs, so you potentially could have more than one on your study, and that's not a problem. With the informed consent, there are certain requirements of the Code of Federal Regulations that have to be made. Most of your CROs will already have an informed consent template that has all of that in it. And a lot of times the IRBs also already have their individual templates that have the basic requirements in it, and then your CRO would help to plug in the specifics of your protocol into that. Also within this is the HIPAA authorization that all U.S. sites have to have. This is normally built in as part of the informed consent, though you will have a signature page for separate from the HIPAA, from the informed consent. So the sites have to sign in multiple places, or subjects have to sign in multiple places on a consent to cover both of these areas. What is nice now is you're starting to see some e-consents occur, and that is nice because it makes it a little more difficult for somebody to not sign a consent in the right places. So after you have your IRB approval and you have all your plans in place and contracts signed, you would look at starting your site initiation visits. I guess I should also say you also will have had your devices all imported and ready to be shipped to the sites as well. And so you'll have FDA approval, IRB approval, reg docs, and then you can start screening and enrolling. So it's a very exciting time, but a lot of work to get up to this. But once it happens, then hopefully things will go very smoothly after that point. A few little tips and tricks that as far as we've seen for communication. It can be very useful to have one main contact at the sponsor organization that's maybe their project manager that interacts with the CRO project manager. Sometimes we've seen when maybe there are multiple people that are in charge, it can get difficult with communication because different people might give your CRO different instructions, and then that can be a cause for confusion. So having a simplified communication plan can be very helpful. We like to put this in the communication plan also with how often do you have meetings. A lot of times you might have to have meetings weekly during study startup to give updates on what's happening. If you expect your study to enroll quickly and it's very short, you might continue to have weekly meetings throughout the life of the study. If enrollment will be a little bit slower, or your study is a longer term study, you might switch later on to having bi-weekly or monthly meetings, depending on the level of oversight needed. Let's see. During the meetings, you're going to want to talk about where you are in your activation of the study with the sites, with the IRB, your database development, qualification, and then once enrollment has begun, then you'll start getting the very exciting updates of where are you, enrollment, recruitment rates, how far are you, what's the anticipated last patient enrolled, how are you with data entry, number of queries in the system, upcoming data locks, upcoming clinical study reports. So you'll have different updates from your CRO depending on where you are in the study. And a lot of times the sponsors also want to know how can they have good communication with study sites and build relationships. One thing you can do, you're not seeing this as much with COVID, but sometimes you're starting to see a little bit occurring is potentially an in-person investigator meeting, or you do see a lot more of web investigator meetings as well, and you just want to make sure everybody has their cameras on so you can actually get some face-to-face interaction. But that can be very helpful to have those meetings where you can talk with the investigators, get to know them a little bit better. We've also had sponsors attend the qualification or initiation visits, and they would attend and be with the CRO, and that way, again, they can meet with the doctors and the sites, see how they interact, and that can be another way to meet some of these doctors. Or, as I mentioned, at some of the U.S. conferences, having one-on-one meetings with these doctors that are attending. You can set up or lunches or dinners and other good ways to really get to know the sites. Sometimes during the course of a study, we will have team study WebExes. Maybe we'll have all the investigators, if there's a new protocol amendment being sent out, or maybe we will have a study coordinator meeting. Maybe we're noticing that sites are having certain queries in the system that we want to go over, so we'll set up a meeting. That can be another great event for the sponsor to join in on and be able to hear what their sites are saying and listen on it. And actually, that is my last slide. I got a little early here. Hope I didn't talk too fast for everybody. All right. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to meeting everybody later.